September 3rd, 1260. The Mongol Empire had never been stopped, not by the great walls of China, not by the armies of Persia, not by the Caliph of Baghdad, whose city they drowned in blood just 2 years before. Now their banners flew over Damascus. Egypt was next. And everyone knew what came after a Mongol ultimatum: submission or annihilation. But when the Mongol envoys arrived in Cairo demanding surrender, the Egyptian Sultan Qutuz did something no one had dared to do. He didn't negotiate. He didn't flee. He cut off their heads. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a declaration. We're not running. Come and take it. What happened next, in a valley called Goliath's Spring, would shatter a myth of invincibility that had terrified the world for half a century. But here's what nobody tells you about this battle. Here's what makes it truly impossible. The Mamluks didn't just defeat the Mongols, they beat them at their own game. And the man who engineered the whole thing? He'd be dead before the celebration ended, murdered by his own general. This is the story of Ain Jalut, the battle that broke the unbreakable, the world on fire. To understand why September 3rd, 1260 matters, you need to understand what the world looked like before that day. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that somewhere, right now, the most terrifying military force in human history is getting closer. Not might be coming. Is coming. Has been coming for 40 years. Has never, not once, been turned back. That was life in the 13th century. The Mongols weren't just conquerors. They were a force of nature. A human tsunami that had swallowed everything from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. Entire civilizations. Gone. Empires that had stood for centuries. Erased. Cities that had flourished for 1,000 years. Reduced to ash and bone. And they didn't just win battles. They annihilated resistance so completely that the very idea of fighting back seemed insane. Consider the numbers. Historians estimate the Mongol conquests killed between 30 and 40 million people in an age before industrial warfare, before bombs, before machine guns. They did it with horses, arrows, and an almost supernatural ability to destroy any army that stood against them. Baghdad, 1258, just 2 years before our story, the jewel of the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city of libraries, scholars, poets. 1 million people lived there. It was the beating heart of a civilization. The Mongols didn't just conquer it, they murdered it. For 40 days, they systematically slaughtered the population. The Tigris River, they said, ran black with ink from the countless books thrown into its waters. Then it ran red. The Caliph himself, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. They wouldn't spill royal blood on the ground. Even their cruelty had rules. Between 1 and 2 million dead. A city that had been the center of learning for 500 years, silenced forever. And Baghdad wasn't special. It was just the latest. Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, Herat, Kiev, each name a graveyard, each city a testament to what happened when you resisted. Or when you surrendered. Sometimes the Mongols killed everyone anyway. You never knew which version you'd get. By early 1260, the Mongol armies had swept through Syria like a plague wind. Damascus fell, Aleppo fell, the great cities of the Levant, fallen, all fallen. The Sultan of Damascus had fled before they even arrived. Smart man. Dead man anyway, eventually. And now there was only one major power left standing in the Islamic world. Egypt, the Mamluk Sultanate, the last domino. Here's what everyone knew. Egypt would fall. It was inevitable. It was mathematical. The Mongols had never lost. Not really, not permanently. They had endless reserves of steppe warriors. They had generals who'd never known defeat. They had a military system so advanced, so perfectly honed, that no medieval army could stand against it. The Egyptian Sultan, Qutuz, had maybe 50,000 soldiers. The Mongol Empire could field hundreds of thousands. Even the reduced force holding Syria was a killing machine that had crushed larger armies without breaking stride. So when Qutuz received that ultimatum, submit or die, everyone expected him to run, to negotiate, to buy time, to do what every other ruler had done when faced with the Mongol tide: flee, beg, pray for mercy that would never come. Instead, he chose war. Was he brave? Desperate? Insane? Maybe all three. But Qutuz knew something. He'd seen something that others had missed. A crack in the invincible machine. A window that would only be open for a moment. And he was going to throw everything through it. The window. Here's the thing about empires. They have problems too. In 1259, the great Khan Munka died. Far away in China, besieging a fortress, the supreme ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen simply died. Some say illness, some say a Chinese arrow. Doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next. Succession crisis. Munka had brothers, Kublai, Arik Boka. Each wanted the throne. Each had supporters. The empire that had moved as one unstoppable force suddenly had to look inward, suddenly had politics, suddenly had problems that couldn't be solved by killing foreigners. Hulagu Khan, the man who had destroyed Baghdad, the terror of the Islamic world, was Munka's brother too. And when news of the death reached him in Syria, he faced a choice: stay and finish conquering the Middle East, or go east and play the succession game. He went east, not with a small escort, with the bulk of his army, tens of thousands of elite Mongol cavalry riding back toward Mongolia to see which brother would rule the world. Left behind in Syria, a general named Kitbuka, and maybe 20,000 soldiers. 20,000, still a terrifying force. Still the army that had helped sack Baghdad. Still Mongols, but not the full horde, not the endless tide. For the first time in decades, a Mongol army in the field was manageable, defeatable, if you were brave enough, skilled enough, lucky enough. Qutuz was watching, calculating. He saw the numbers shift. He saw the impossible become merely improbable. And he made his decision. The envoys arrived in Cairo with their standard demands. The same demands they'd delivered to 100 cities. Submit, pay tribute, open your gates, or die. Every man, woman, and child. Qutuz gathered his emirs, his generals, his council of war. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to flee south into Africa. Buy time, hope the Mongols got distracted. Reasonable positions, sane positions. Qutuz listened to them all. Then he had the envoys dragged to Bab Zuwayla, one of the great gates of Cairo. And there, in front of the gathered crowd, he had them beheaded. Their heads mounted on spikes, their bodies displayed for all to see. No negotiation, no submission, no mercy. The message wasn't just for the Mongols, it was for his own people, for the emirs who wanted to run, for every soldier who thought survival meant surrender. We fight. All of us. Together. There is no other option now. He had burned every bridge, closed every door. There would be no peace, no terms, victory or annihilation. The Mongols would come now. They had to. Their entire system depended on fear, on the certainty that resistance meant death. If one city, one sultan, one army defied them and lived, everything they'd built would start to crumble. Qutuz was betting Egypt's existence on a single battle, a single day, and he was about to march north to meet the most terrifying army on earth. But he wasn't going alone, and his secret weapon wasn't what anyone expected. The secret weapon. Here's where the story takes a turn nobody expects. When you picture the Battle of Ain Jalut, what do you see? Brave but outmatched Egyptian soldiers? Farmers with spears facing down the apocalypse? A desperate last stand of infantry against the greatest cavalry force in history? Wrong. All wrong. The Mamluks weren't underdogs in the way you think. They weren't peasant levies or conscript armies or noble knights who'd never seen real war. They were something else entirely, something the Mongols had never faced before. They were monsters, too. Let me explain. The word Mamluk means owned or slave. And that's exactly what they were, slave soldiers. But don't let that word fool you. These weren't broken men in chains. These were the most elite, most highly trained, most terrifyingly effective warriors the Islamic world had ever produced. Here's how it worked. Young boys, usually Turkic or Circassian, from the steppes of Central Asia, were purchased or captured, 8, 9, 10 years old, torn from their families, brought to Egypt, and then transformed. For years, sometimes a decade or more, they trained every single day, horsemanship until they could ride like they were born in the saddle, archery until they could hit targets at full gallop, swordsmanship, lance work, wrestling, every form of combat known to the medieval world. They lived together, trained together, bled together. They had no families except each other, no loyalty except to their regiment and their sultan, no identity except warrior. By the time they were finished, they weren't boys anymore. They weren't even normal soldiers. They were weapons, human weapons, forged in a furnace of endless training and absolute discipline. And here's the part that changes everything. They were horse archers, just like the Mongols. For 50 years, the Mongol military system had crushed every opponent because nobody could match their mobility, their speed, their ability to shower enemies with arrows and dance away before anyone could strike back. European knights in heavy armor? Too slow. Chinese infantry? Too static. Persian cavalry? Not disciplined enough. The Mongols won because they fought in a way nobody else could match, until now. The Mamluks could match them. Arrow for arrow, maneuver for maneuver, trick for trick. Same steppe heritage, same horse culture, same composite bows that could punch through armor at 200 meters, same ability to fire accurately from a galloping horse. But the Mamluks had something the Mongols didn't. Heavier armor, better discipline under pressure, and a training regimen so intense, so unrelenting, that their unit cohesion was virtually unbreakable. See, the Mongol system depended on one thing above all else, making their enemies break. Panic. Flee. The moment an army's formation shattered, the Mongols would ride them down like wolves hunting scattered sheep. That's how they won. Not by grinding toe-to-toe slugfests, but by making their opponents run, and then slaughtering them in the chaos. Every army they'd faced had eventually broken. Every single one. Some held longer than others, some fought bravely. But in the end, when the arrows fell like rain, and the Mongol cavalry swept around their flanks, and the screaming started, they ran. The Mamluks were trained specifically not to run. Not ever. Not under any circumstances. When other soldiers would flee, Mamluks would hold. When other cavalry would scatter, Mamluks would reform. When the battle seemed lost, Mamluks would counterpunch. This wasn't courage in the normal sense. This was conditioning, programming, years of training that had burned one truth into their bones. The unit survives together or dies together. There is no running. There is only the regiment. Kutuz wasn't leading lambs to slaughter. He was leading wolves to hunt wolves. And he had one wolf in particular who was worth an army by himself. The commander. His name was Baybars. Remember that name. It's going to matter. Baybars al-Bundukdari, a Mamluk of the Bari regiment. Tall, blue-eyed, unusual for a Turk, which led to legends that he was Kuman or Kipchak or something stranger still. A white spot in one eye, they said. You'd recognize him across a battlefield. He'd been sold as a slave boy like all the others, trained like all the others. But something in Baybars was different, something harder, colder, more ruthless. He'd already saved Egypt once, Years earlier, when the Seventh Crusade brought King Louis IX of France to Egyptian shores, it was Baybars who led the cavalry charge at Mansoura that shattered the Crusader army. Louis himself was captured. The greatest king in Christendom, brought low by a former slave. Baybars was brilliant, charismatic, absolutely without mercy. He was also dangerous, so dangerous that the previous sultan had tried to have him killed. Baybars had fled to Syria, gathered followers, waited. When Qutuz took power and the Mongol threat became existential, he called Baybars back. The two men needed each other. Qutuz needed Baybars's military genius. Baybars needed Qutuz's legitimacy and throne. It was an alliance of necessity, not trust. Never trust. Qutuz made Baybars commander of the vanguard, the front of the army, the first to make contact with the Mongols. Was this a reward? Or was Qutuz hoping the Mongols would solve his Baybars problem for him? Maybe both. Either way, Baybars now held Egypt's fate in his hands. The slave who'd become a general. The exile who'd become indispensable. The man with ice in his veins and ambition that burned like fire. He was about to face the Mongols. And he had a plan. The March, July 1260. The Egyptian army moves north. Imagine them. Thousands of cavalry riding out of Cairo, across the Sinai, into Palestine. The cream of the Mamluk military. Professional soldiers, elite warriors, men who'd trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. Qutuz rode with them. The Sultan himself. Not hiding in Cairo, not directing from safety. In the field. With his men. If Egypt fell, he would fall with it. They moved fast. Faster than anyone expected. The Mongols had spies everywhere. They always did. But the Mamluk advance caught them off guard. And then Qutuz did something unexpected. He sent messengers to the Crusader states. Yes, the Crusaders. The Christians who'd been fighting Muslims for control of the Holy Land for 200 years. The enemies of Islam. The invaders from Europe. Qutuz proposed an alliance. Think about that. The Mamluk Sultan, defender of Islam, reaching out to the Crusader kingdoms, asking for help, or at least safe passage, against the Mongols. And here's the miracle. They said yes. Not all of them. Some Crusader lords wanted to ally with the Mongols instead. Let the pagans and Muslims slaughter each other, then pick up the pieces. Classic Crusader thinking. But the lords of Acre, the main Crusader stronghold, made a different calculation. The Mongols had already destroyed Christian kingdoms in the east. Georgian Christians. Armenian Christians, crushed without mercy. The Mongols didn't care what god you prayed to. They cared about submission. So Acre let the Mamluk army pass. More than that, they provided supplies, fresh horses, intelligence about Mongol movements, Christians helping Muslims march to war, the enemy of my enemy, strange alliances in desperate times. The Mamluk army pushed north through Galilee, beautiful country, green hills, ancient valleys, land that had seen 1,000 battles over 1,000 years. Somewhere ahead, Kitbuka was waiting. 20,000 Mongol veterans, men who'd sacked Baghdad, men who'd never known defeat. They knew the Egyptians were coming now. The element of surprise was gone. But Kitbuka wasn't worried. Why would he be? He'd crushed larger armies. He'd broken stronger defenders. These Egyptians would run like all the others. Every army ran eventually. That was the one truth of Mongol warfare. The one constant. Push hard enough, kill enough, terrify enough. And they always broke. Kitbuka gathered his forces, sent word to Mongol garrisons across Syria, prepared to meet this Egyptian sultan who thought he could fight the tide. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Because Baybars wasn't just marching north to fight. He was marching north to spring a trap. The valley. The place was called Ain Jalut, in Arabic, the Spring of Goliath. Local legend said this was where David killed the giant 3,000 years before. The spring still flowed, feeding a lush valley in the hills of Galilee. Baybars had chosen this ground. Specifically, deliberately. Why here? Look at a map. The valley of Ain Jalut is surrounded by hills, ridges, high ground that conceals movement. A force positioned in the valley would seem exposed, but a clever commander could hide entire regiments in those hills. And there was something else. The valley runs roughly east to west. If you positioned your army on the western side in the early morning, your enemy would advance from the east, directly into the rising sun, blinding light in their eyes, shadows hiding your movements. A simple advantage, but in battle, simple advantages kill. Baybars knew the terrain. He'd campaigned in this region before. He knew every hill, every fold in the ground, every place where cavalry could hide. And he knew Mongol tactics. He knew their favorite tricks because they were his tricks too. Feigned retreat, pretend to flee, draw the enemy into pursuit, then turn and slaughter them when they're strung out and disorganized. The Mongols had used this technique to destroy army after army. Baybars was about to use it against them. The night before the battle, the Mamluk army moved into position. Quietly, carefully, the main force hidden in the hills. Only Baybars and his vanguard visible in the valley below. A small force, maybe a few thousand riders, exposed, vulnerable. Bait. Qutuz waited with the reserves, hidden from sight. Every emir knew his position. Every regiment knew its role. This wasn't a desperate charge. This was a choreographed killing ground, if it worked. If the Mongols took the bait. If the Mamluks could hold when the storm hit. A lot of ifs, a lot of ways to die. Dawn was coming, September 3rd, 1260. The day that would decide everything. Somewhere to the east, Kitbuka's army was stirring. 20,000 killers who'd never been stopped. They were about to walk into a trap. The trap springs dawn, September 3rd, 1260. The sun rose over the hills of Galilee, throwing long shadows across the valley of Ain Jalut. In that golden light, Baybars waited with his vanguard. A few thousand riders, exposed, visible, waiting to be found. Kitbuka's scouts reported the Egyptian force just after sunrise. A small army, isolated, no sign of reinforcements. The Mongol general smiled. This was too easy. The foolish Egyptians had split their forces, sent an advance guard without proper support. Classic mistake. He'd punish them for it. Kitbuka ordered the attack. 20,000 Mongol cavalry swept into the valley, the thunder of hooves, the war cries that had terrified half the world, banners snapping in the morning wind. They expected the Egyptians to run. They always ran. Baybars held his ground. His men formed up, arrows nocked, waiting. The Mongols closed the distance, 500 meters, 400, 300. The Mamluks fired. A storm of arrows. Mongol horses screamed and fell. Riders tumbled. But the charge didn't stop. Mongols fired back, their own arrows darkening the sky, and then Baybars did exactly what Kitbuka expected. He ran. The Mamluk vanguard wheeled and fled. Horses at full gallop, riders bent low, racing back toward the western end of the valley. Panic. Rout. Exactly what always happened when armies faced Mongol fury. Kitbuka kicked his horse forward. Pursuit. The kill was coming. This is the moment. This is where armies die. Fleeing cavalry can't fight, can't regroup, can't do anything but run until the arrows find their backs. The Mongols had done this 100 times, 1,000 times. Chase, slaughter, victory. But Baybars wasn't running in panic. He was running on a schedule. The vanguard fled west through the valley, Mongols howling behind them. Kitbuka pushed his men hard, sensing total victory. The Egyptians were breaking, just like everyone else. Then the hills came alive. from the northern ridge, from the southern slopes, from every fold of ground where cavalry could hide. Thousands of Mamluk riders erupted into view. The trap was sprung. Baybar's vanguard stopped running, wheeled, reformed with impossible speed. What looked like a panicked rout transformed into a disciplined fighting line in seconds. The Mongols were surrounded. Kitbuka realized the truth in a single, terrible heartbeat. He hadn't been chasing a broken enemy. He'd been lured into a killing ground. The small force was bait. The hidden armies were the jaws. And those jaws were closing. The breaking point. What happened next was unlike anything in Mongol military history. Kitbuka didn't panic. He was too good for that. 20 years of warfare had taught him that battles turn on moments of decision. He had to break out of this encirclement before it solidified. He chose his point, the Mamluk left wing, and threw everything at it. The Mongol charge was devastating. Veteran warriors who'd conquered half the world, fighting with the desperation of trapped wolves. They hit the Mamluk left like a battering ram, and it worked. The Mamluk left wing buckled. Men fell, horses screamed. The line bent backward, then began to break. Gaps opened in the formation. This is the moment. This is when armies shatter. When discipline fails and men become individuals, each one thinking only of survival. The Mongols had seen it happen so many times. The crack in the dam. The moment before the flood. One more push and these Egyptians would run like all the others. They pushed. The Mamluk left wing held, bent nearly to breaking, bleeding, dying, but not running, not scattering, not becoming a panicked mob that could be slaughtered at will. They held. Sultan Qutuz himself rode into the chaos, the ruler of Egypt, sword in hand, screaming at his men, "Wa Islama! Oh my Islam!" A rallying cry that cut through the din of battle. He threw off his helmet so his soldiers could see his face, so they could see their sultan fighting beside them, dying beside them if necessary. The line stabilized. The crack didn't become a collapse. Somehow, impossibly, the Mamluks absorbed the most devastating charge the Mongols could deliver, and counter-punched. Fresh regiments swept into the gaps. The encirclement tightened. What had been a desperate Mongol breakout became a Mongol retreat, then a Mongol rout. For the first time in half a century, the psychological equation reversed. Mongols were running, Mamluks were hunting. The kill Kitbuka refused to flee. His army was dying around him, but the old general kept fighting. Surrounded by his personal guard, he cut down Mamluk after Mamluk. 60 years old, covered in blood, still dangerous. His men begged him to retreat. Save yourself. Fight another day. "If I must die here," Kitbuka reportedly said, "then I die, but I will not flee from slaves." The irony. Calling Mamluks slaves as an insult, not understanding that their slavery was their strength. They had no homes to flee to, no families to protect, nothing but each other and the regiment. Running wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. Kitbuka fought until his horse was killed beneath him. Fought on foot until he was overwhelmed. The man who had helped destroy Baghdad, captured and bound. They brought him before the Mamluk commanders, battered, bleeding, defiant to the last. "If I die by your hands," Kitbuka told them, "I consider it God's will, not your valor. Don't be deceived by this moment. When the news reaches Hulagu, Khan, the sea of his wrath will boil over." He was executed immediately. His head would be sent back to Cairo, mounted on a spear. Proof of the impossible. The Mongols had lost, not a skirmish, not a raid, a major battle. The cream of their Syrian army, destroyed. Their general, dead. Their myth of invincibility, shattered. September 3rd, 1260. The day everything changed. Let's pause. Let's understand what actually occurred in that valley. For 50 years, the Mongols had conquered everything, every army, every empire, every civilization that stood against them. They weren't just good, they were so dominant that resistance seemed pointless. And then, in a single morning, it ended. How? Why? What made Ain Jalut different? The answer isn't simple. It's not one thing. It's a perfect storm of factors that came together at exactly the right moment. First, the numbers. Hulagu's withdrawal changed everything. For the first time, a Mongol field army was roughly equal to its opponent. Not outnumbered. The Mongols had won against worse odds before, but not enjoying their usual overwhelming advantage. 20,000 against perhaps 25,000. Manageable. Beatable. Second, the terrain. Baybars chose Ain Jalut specifically because it limited Mongol mobility. The valley, the hills, the enclosed space, all of it reduced the Mongols' ability to use their favorite tactics. No room for the sweeping flank attacks, no space for the endless harassment. They had to fight in a box. Third, and this is the crucial one, the Mamluks didn't break. Every army the Mongols had faced eventually shattered. That was the Mongol way of war. They didn't win through direct confrontation. They won by making their enemies panic. Feigned retreats to draw them out, arrow storms to soften them up, flank attacks to terrify them. And when the formation cracked, when men started running, the slaughter began. The Mamluks absorbed everything and kept fighting. When the left wing buckled, it didn't collapse. When Kitbuka threw his desperate breakout charge, the line bent but didn't break. When other armies would have dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals, the Mamluks reformed, regrouped, counterattacked. This wasn't courage alone. Courage can break. This was training so deep, so ingrained, that holding formation was automatic. Years of conditioning, decades of preparation, a military culture that made unit cohesion sacred. Fourth, they knew the tricks. The feigned retreat, the Mongols' favorite technique, only works if your enemy takes the bait, if they chase you in disorder, thinking you're really fleeing. Baybars used it against them because he knew they'd recognize it as genuine panic. They'd seen 100 armies break exactly that way, but he also knew they'd fall for it because they couldn't imagine anyone using their own tactic against them. Arrogance. The assumption that steppe warfare was Mongol warfare, that no one else could master those techniques. The Mamluks were steppe warriors too. Same heritage, same skills, same tricks. When Baybars fled, the Mongols saw what they expected to see. Another army breaking. They didn't consider, couldn't consider, that it was a performance, that the panicked rout was actually a precision maneuver timed to the minute. Fifth, leadership. Kutus in the midst of battle, rallying his men at the critical moment. Baybars commanding the vanguard with ice-cold precision. Emirs who held their positions even when the situation seemed hopeless. The Mongols had great commanders too. Kitbuka was no fool. But on this day, in this valley, the Mamluk leadership was better, more adaptive, more willing to risk themselves. When Kutus threw off his helmet and charged into the wavering left wing, he wasn't just fighting. He was saying, "I'm here, your sultan is here. We die together or win together. That matters." In the chaos of battle, when men are terrified and exhausted and watching their friends die, that matters more than tactics. The myth dies. The Mongols had been invincible for so long that people had stopped believing they could lose. This wasn't just reputation, it was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. Cities surrendered without fighting because they knew resistance was futile. Armies dissolved before battle because soldiers knew they couldn't win. Kings and sultans fled their capitals because they knew the Mongols would destroy everything regardless. The myth of Mongol invincibility was itself a weapon, maybe their greatest weapon. It conquered more territory than any arrow ever could. Ain Jalut killed that myth. The news spread across the Islamic world like wildfire. The Mongols can be beaten. The Mongols have been beaten. A Mamluk army met them in open battle and destroyed them. Suddenly, resistance seemed possible. Suddenly, the inevitable didn't look so inevitable. In Syria, cities that had submitted to Mongol rule began to revolt. Damascus rose up. Aleppo threw out its Mongol garrison. The entire structure of Mongol control in the Levant, built on fear, maintained by terror, crumbled in weeks. The Mongols would try to return. They'd launch campaigns into Syria for decades. But they'd never recapture what they'd lost. The high water mark had been reached. The tide was receding. Ain Jalut didn't destroy the Mongol Empire. It remained the largest land empire in human history for another century. But it broke the momentum, ended the expansion, drew a line that would never be crossed. The Mongols had conquered from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. They would go no further. Egypt would remain free. Africa would be spared. Western Islam would survive. Because of one battle, one day, one army that refused to run. The twist. But this story isn't over yet. The hero's victory should end with celebration, triumph, the Sultan returning to Cairo draped in glory, ruling a grateful nation for decades to come. That's not what happened. October 1260. 1 month after Ain Jalut, the Mamluk army is marching home through the Sinai, returning to Egypt in triumph. Qutuz rides at the head of the column, the savior of Islam, the man who did the impossible. His legend is already spreading across the world. He decides to go hunting. A brief detour. A chance to relax after months of tension and war. He rides out with a small group of companions. Among them, Baibars. What happened next depends on who tells the story. Some say Qutuz had promised Baibars the governorship of Aleppo, then gave it to someone else. Some say Baibars had always planned this. Some say there was a woman involved. Isn't there always? The details don't matter. The result does. Baibars rode up beside Qutuz, asked the Sultan for a favor. Some accounts say he wanted to present a captive girl. Others say he requested a private word. Qutuz extended his hand. Baibars took it. And then, with his other hand, he drove a sword into the Sultan's chest. The man who saved Egypt from the Mongols died in the desert, murdered by his own general, less than 2 months after his greatest victory. Baibars rode back to the army, announced that Qutuz was dead, announced that he, Baibars, was now Sultan. Anyone want to argue? No one argued. Baibars al-Bundukdari, former slave, former exile, architect of the trap at Ain Jalut, murderer of the man who made him general, now Sultan of Egypt. It should have been chaos, a usurper seizing power through assassination, the army still in the field, enemies on every border. The perfect recipe for civil war. Instead, it was seamless. Baibars had planned this as carefully as he'd planned the battle. The emirs who might have opposed him were already neutralized, bought, threatened, or simply absent at the critical moment. The soldiers who might have avenged Qutuz were the same soldiers who'd followed Baibars into the teeth of the Mongol army. They knew who'd really won at Ain Jalut. Within days, Baibars was recognized as Sultan. Within weeks, he was consolidating power with a ruthlessness that made the Mongols look gentle. And here's the dark miracle. He was brilliant at it. Baibars ruled for 17 years. In that time, he transformed the Mamluk Sultanate from a desperate survivor into the dominant power of the Middle East. He drove the Crusaders from fortress after fortress. Acre, Antioch. Castles that had stood for a century fell to his armies. He pushed the Mongols back whenever they tried to return. Built a spy network that stretched from Constantinople to Mongolia. Created a postal system so efficient that he could receive news from Damascus in 4 days. The man was a monster. Also a genius. He killed without hesitation. Blinded rivals, executed prisoners, broke every treaty when it suited him. But he also built hospitals, schools, mosques, reformed the military, stabilized the economy, made Egypt the center of the Islamic world for generations. Ain Jalut made him. The victory gave him the reputation, the army, the opportunity. Without that battle, Baybars would be a footnote, another ambitious general who never quite reached the throne. Instead, he became one of the most significant rulers of the medieval world, a former slave who built an empire on the corpse of the man who trusted him. History doesn't care about justice. It cares about results. The legacy. So what do we make of Ain Jalut? Was it really the first Mongol defeat? Technically, no. The Mongols had lost battles before, small engagements, raids gone wrong, the occasional setback in their endless wars. They'd been fought to a standstill in Vietnam, in Java, in Japan, though typhoons did most of the work there. But none of those defeats mattered the way Ain Jalut mattered. This was a major Mongol field army, commanded by a senior general, meeting an enemy in open battle and being destroyed. Not retreating, not withdrawing, destroyed. The general captured and executed. The army shattered beyond recovery. More importantly, this was the defeat that stuck. The Mongols never took Egypt, never crossed into Africa, never completed their conquest of the Islamic world. The boundary drawn at Ain Jalut held for 700 years, until the Mongol successor states themselves crumbled into dust. One battle, one day, a line across history. The lesson. There's something almost mythological about Ain Jalut, David and Goliath, literally at Goliath's spring. The unstoppable force meeting the immovable object. The monster that had devoured the world finally finding something it couldn't digest. But the real lesson isn't about myth. It's about preparation. The Mamluks didn't win because of luck. They didn't win because God was on their side. They didn't win because the Mongols made mistakes. They won because they'd spent decades building an army specifically designed to fight this kind of enemy. Cavalry that could match Mongol mobility. Archers that could match Mongol firepower. Training that created unbreakable unit cohesion. Leadership that could adapt in the chaos of battle. When the moment came, they were ready. Kutuz saw the window, Hulagu's withdrawal, and seized it. Baybars chose the terrain, set the trap, and executed it perfectly. The emirs held their positions when everything seemed lost. The soldiers refused to break when breaking was the natural, human, reasonable response to 20,000 screaming Mongols. It wasn't a miracle. It was preparation meeting opportunity. The Mongols had built the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. They'd conquered more territory, killed more people, destroyed more civilizations than any force in human history. But they'd also grown arrogant, assumed no one could match them, believed their own myth of invincibility. At Ain Jalut, they met an enemy who didn't believe the myth, who'd studied their tactics, who'd built an army to counter everything that made them terrifying. And that enemy didn't run. The final word, September 3rd, 1260. A valley in Galilee, a spring called Goliath's Fountain. Two armies that had never known defeat. The Mongols came expecting another easy slaughter. Another army that would break and run. Another chapter in their endless conquest. Instead, they found men who'd been forged in fire. Slaves who'd become soldiers. Soldiers who'd become something harder than steel. The Mamluks didn't just win. They proved something. Something the whole world needed to see. The Mongols could be beaten. The inevitable wasn't inevitable. The monster could bleed. Empires rise, empires fall. But they don't fall to armies that run away. They don't fall to men who believe they can't win. They fall when they meet someone who looks at the impossible and says, "Not today." Kutuz said it with the heads of Mongol envoys on the gates of Cairo. Baybars said it with a trap that turned Mongol tactics against them. Thousands of Mamluk soldiers said it by holding their line when every instinct screamed at them to flee. The Mongols had conquered half the world by making their enemies run. At Ain Jalut, they finally met men who stood. And standing, just standing, when the whole world expected you to fall, can change history. It did that day. It always does.